Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This webinar, Reserve Studies Under the Hood, is designed to be an introduction to reserve studies from a homeowner, board member, or manager's point of view. So today I'm going to answer questions like, what is a reserve study and what's it for? What do you find in a reserve study? And I'll give you some helpful hints on how to find it. What do you do with a reserve study? And what size contributions are normal? If this is the type of information you'd find helpful, you come to the right place. So today we're going to pop open the hood and take a look inside. I hope you're ready to see what this thing called a reserve study does, see how the parts connect, and see how you work with it on an ongoing basis. I'm going to use examples from the reserve studies of many different companies because this session is a general introduction based on National Reserve Study standards. It applies to all associations and all reserve study companies, not just association reserves. So as Chris mentioned, my name's Robert Nordland. That's a picture of the guy talking there. I've been preparing reserve studies for 25 years and I've done thousands of reserve studies. So while it's second nature to me, it's not as familiar to you. So since this is a live webinar, as I go through today's material, and as Chris mentioned a moment ago, if you have any questions, type it into the question dialog box, which is probably on the right-hand side of your screen in your webinar control panel area. Chris will monitor those throughout the session, and I'll handle them at the Q&A time at the end of today's session together. So let me get started with today's curriculum. A reserve study is fundamentally a report, custom for each association with different information each year. It'll often look something like this, a report for your association for a particular year. It'll contain a number of charts and graphs showing a breakdown of current needs and projections and recommendations for future years. Fundamentally, a reserve study is based on tables of information, components, years, and expenses. Sometimes you'll see color designed to bring additional meaning or emphasis. And then there will typically be trends, often shown graphically, sometimes in color or even in 3D. And more tables, more color, more columns of income and expenses. So it's no surprise that the average person finds a subject of reserve studies confusing or finds all the different reserve study formats confusing. So I'm going to take a few steps back, start at the beginning, and come in the front door. This is what a good common area tennis court looks like. And this is what a bad common area tennis court looks like. What's the difference? The amount of money the board chose to collect from the homeowners through the years for the purpose of spending on keeping it in good, usable condition. In this case, the board didn't have the money they hoped to have. Now remember that phrase, hoped to have. Many boards have good intentions, hoping things will all work out in the future. They figure reserves are not their problem. They figure that future boards and future homeowners will worry about those future problems. And isn't that often the case? But that's fundamentally wrong thinking. The truth is that deterioration happens every day. Deterioration and the cost of deterioration happens every day. The roof, the paint, the asphalt, the elevator, any of your common area components are getting older and less valuable each day. Deterioration is a daily cost. The association might only face a reserve bill once every few years, but deterioration and the cost of deterioration is a daily event. Another important concept is that deterioration is inevitable, and it's the board's responsibility to offset that deterioration with a plan to take care of the common areas. Homeowners are not responsible to take care of the pool that they enjoy. It's the board's responsibility that the common area pool and all the other areas are in good functional condition. Individuals and families relying on the board to take care of all those common areas. It's not maintenance that they are capable or even able to do. They're not supposed to get up on their own roof in a condominium and start monkeying around with things up there. Now, in order for board members to fulfill their responsibility to take care of the common areas, they need a plan. They need to know which reserve bills are coming and when they are coming and what they need to do to prepare financially. A reserve study helps a board fulfill their responsibility to take care of the common areas for all the homeowners who live there. Another fundamental concept is that while reserve deterioration is a daily event, the bills that happen infrequently are all scattered through the years. So from one year to the next, the reserve expenses might be 20 times lower or higher than the year before. It's not an easy thing to budget for these seemingly random, irregular, but significant expenses. It's really a pretty good problem. All too many boards and managers just look at the problem and figure it's too complicated, so they just cross their fingers and hope for the best. But that's because they don't have a reserve study to give them their decision points and to act as a guide. Without a current year, credible reserve study, you're forced to guess and hope for the best. But wishful thinking is not an effective plan, and wishful thinking is not a responsible way for board members to take care of the common areas. But a reserve study is more than just a report that provides budget guidance for the board. A reserve study is a document you can use to deal with the anxieties and rumors at your association. And by distributing the reserve study, you minimize that misinformation and surprise among the members. With the reserve study, you communicate the plan to take care of the association, and there's going to be less rumors, anxiety, and general worry among the homeowners. You've got enough of that going on for other reasons. So, what type of budget help do you actually get from a reserve study? And what information will you be communicating to the homeowners in this plan? Let me illustrate by talking about taking a road trip, getting from point A to point B. You need to pick a route and figure out your plan to get there. That's it. That's the secret to understanding a reserve study. It's all about defining where I'm going to see the Broadway show and the Statue of Liberty out there in New York. And where am I starting? In Denver. And how am I going to get there? By packing, filling up the tank, picking some overnight stops along the way. Unfortunately, in the field of reserves, we have a good roadmap. It's called National Reserve Study Standards. And since 1998, these standards have given us a common terminology, standard calculations, and standard disclosures that provide us a framework for creating and presenting these plans to boards, managers, and homeowners. These National Reserve Study Standards tell us that every reserve study has 3 parts, each one providing some key information. The 3 parts are the reserve component list, which is an reserve component list, an evaluation of reserve fund strength, which is typically reported in terms of percent funded, and a reserve funding plan. That component list defines what your journey is all about, what assets you're caring for with reserve funds. A computation of reserve fund strength tells you where you're starting, and a funding plan is your chosen route or plan to provide funds for the timely repairs or replacement projects defined by your reserve component list. So the component list forms the foundation, the journey you're about to take. Reserve fund strength and funding plan are computed based on that component list. They're both only as accurate or effective as the accuracy of the component list. Now here's what a sample reserve component list looks like. It's excerpted from an actual reserve study. It's a table showing the major projects this association is going to accomplish using its reserve funds. And here's a sample reserve component list table that I've made up, big enough for you to see and follow along as I explain. The important information you'll find in a reserve component list is a description of the project, its useful life, years of remaining useful life, and the current replacement cost. The list itself defines the scope of your reserve projects, and the combination of useful life and remaining useful life defines the schedule of reserve projects. Some reserve studies lay out the schedule vertically, 1 year at a time, and some show the schedule of reserve expenses horizontally across the page, again, a year at a time. So in summary, the reserve component list shows the major components the association will be maintaining with reserves, which defines the scope and the schedule of your anticipated expenses. Well, now let's move on to the measurement of reserve fund strength. National Reserve Study standards require an evaluation of reserve fund strength to reveal how well the current funds fit the needs of the association and to allow the board and the members an understanding of where they're starting. Since small associations need a significantly different amount of cash compared to large associations, and the amount of cash an association needs varies from year to year due to those irregular expenses, in this industry we report reserve fund strength on a relative basis using a term called percent funded. There's 3 situations an association can find itself in. Associations with more deterioration than reserve funds are in a deficit situation. Associations with reserves on hand approximately equal to the amount of their common area deterioration can claim that the reserve fund is in balance. And associations with more reserve cash than deterioration can claim to be in a surplus situation. It's all a matter of comparing the deterioration of the association's reserve assets to the size of the reserve fund. Knowing your reserve fund strength is important because special assessments are directly related to the strength of an association's reserve fund. It's not surprising when you think about it. When an association is unprepared financially for the scheduled reserve projects, it often finds itself without enough cash and faces a special assessment. And the more serious the deficit is as you move towards the left on this slide, the higher the chance of a special assessment. And here's a table summarizing that same information, showing the importance of knowing your percent funded. When the reserve fund is weak, in the 0 to 30% range, associations experience special assessments about 37% of the time. In other words, about 1 out of every 3 years an association has a percent funded in the 0 to 30% range, they'll need a special assessment to perform their scheduled reserve projects. On the other hand, special assessments are rare among associations in the strong range, over 70% funded. And of course, associations in the fair range are in the middle zone, experiencing special assessments only about 10% of the time. And now let's transition to the journey portion, actually funding your reserves. How are you going to provide for those scheduled reserve projects, knowing your starting point? But first, let me stop and make sure you understand that percent funded calculations are not related to any funding plan calculations. National Reserve Study standards define how percent funded is calculated, but they allow flexibility with methods and ways to fund your reserves. You can choose the straight line method, cash flow method, or it seems like, as some associations do, even throwing darts at the wall to choose a reserve contribution rate. Now let me stop and make sure you understand that I'm not recommending throwing darts at the wall. Calculating percent funded or reserve fund strength and calculating a funding plan are unrelated. Your reserve fund strength defines your starting point, not your route. What you do with your funding plan is to direct the association towards having enough funds for the timely repair and replacement of your scheduled reserve projects without relying on unfair and uncertain special assessments. A strong reserve fund means less risk of a special assessment, and a weak reserve fund means a higher risk of a special assessment. How much money does this take? Well, it's different at each association depending on the size of the association, of course, the construction tile, the types and complexity of common area assets, and the amount of reserve deterioration they already have. But in general, most associations find an appropriate amount of reserve contributions are anywhere in the 15 to 40% range of their total budget. How much for your association this year is going to be found in your reserve study, but typically you'll find it somewhere in the 15 to 40% range. And what's the consequence of under-reserving? Well, it's running out of money. In our car trip illustration, it means running out of gas. This means not reaching your goal of providing enough cash for the scheduled repair and replacement projects at the association. So, what if you aren't making your recommended reserve contributions? Start. If your association has a history of deferred maintenance and special assessments, your homeowners deserve better. Remember, your homeowners are depending on you, the board members, to collect enough funds on an ongoing basis so they won't be surprised someday with a special assessment letter. And while I'm on the topic of funding your reserves, let me remind you that the effects of interest do not equal the effects of inflation. You can't just imagine that they're going to offset each other. This matters because you only earn interest on your actual reserve cash in the bank, and that's always going to be much less than the total value of all your reserve projects, which grows with inflation each year. So you need a plan that accounts for interest and inflation. And now that you know what information is in a reserve study, let me take a moment to explain the three types of reserve studies. Like the chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry ice cream shown here, National Reserve Study Standards define three types of reserve studies. You need to understand the difference because you need to know which one is the right choice for your association. The three types of reserve studies are full, update with site visit, and update no site visit. A full reserve study is something most associations will only ever need once, because a full reserve study involves measuring all the common area assets and establishing the initial reserve component list. After that, every few years it's good to have an update with site visit reserve study, where every asset is inspected, but it's a less expensive engagement because the assets aren't being remeasured. There's a lot less time involved. For example, once you know you have 85,000 square feet of asphalt, you don't need to pay for another full reserve study to have it and the roof and the fencing and the carpeting all remeasured. An update no site visit is a good cost-effective choice for the years in between update with site visits. This type of reserve study updates your replacement costs, remaining useful life, starting balance, percent funded, and funding plan, all without the time, effort, and cost of an on-site inspection. This is the simplest and least expensive type of reserve study. Now, who do you choose to prepare your reserve study? Or from whom might you request a proposal for the type of reserve study that you need? Well, you look for two credentials. Both are very similar. The Reserve Specialist, or RS, is one of the professional credentials available through the Community Associations Institute. And the PRA is the Professional Reserve Analyst designation awarded by the Association of Professional Reserve Analysts. Both have similar educational requirements, experience requirements, and they both share the same terminology and disclosure requirements. So they'll both give you the same confidence that you're using a reserve study professional. And once you have your reserve study, hopefully by a credentialed provider, and you've decided on a recommended budgeted reserve contribution rate, what do you actually do? Who do you give the reserve contributions to? Well, yourself, actually. Making your reserve contributions just means making a transfer of your budgeted reserve contribution from checking, the operating account, to savings, the reserve account. And in your monthly budget report, you get to show that you've moved the appropriate amount from checking to savings. Some associations go to the extra effort of breaking down the reserve transfer into a number of different categories and accounting for the change in size of all these reserve categories on an ongoing basis. But don't worry, that's not necessary. You don't need to go to this level of detail accounting for all the internal reserve allocations. Making the monthly total transfer from operating to reserves is the key. And then when it's time to pay for a reserve project, you move the amount back from savings to your checking account so you can write a check to the vendor. So the normal process is to transfer the funds into reserves on a regular basis and withdraw funds from reserves in advance of actually paying the bill for the reserve project. Now, how do you read a reserve study? And how do you find all this good information? The key is to know what you're looking for because it's going to be in different places in each company's different reserve format. Remember the basics. You're primarily looking for the reserve component list, an evaluation of reserve fund strength, and a recommended reserve funding plan. But what do these things look like? Where are you going to find them? So let me give you some examples from a few reserve studies to give you an idea of what you're looking for. In this company's format, you find a lot right on the front cover. You see the professional's RS seal, the type of reserve study, this is a with site visit update, and the year. It's for the fiscal year 2012 to 2013. And in this report, you see a nice, clear presentation of the component list. In this company's report, the year and the funding recommendations are on their executive summary page. And here's another executive summary page showing reserve fund strength and the recommended contribution amount. In different companies' reserve studies, this information is on different pages, but you'll find it's all there. And the other key information to look for, just as we discussed, look for the fiscal year for which the reserve study was prepared, because it helps you understand if the reserve study is current or outdated. And look who prepared the report. If it's someone with a RS or PRA credential, and that shows how reliable the report is. And look for what type of reserve study it is. A full update with site visit or update no site visit, because that tells you how the report was prepared. But at this point in time, about a half hour in, I imagine your mind is swirling. So let me bring this subject back into focus, summarizing the basics of what you'll find under the hood in a reserve study. A reserve study helps you plot a successful journey into the future. It answers the three questions: where am I going? where am I starting, and how do I get to my destination? In a reserve study, the answer to the first question of where you're going or what you're trying to accomplish in this journey is the scope and schedule of your reserve projects defined in your reserve component list. The second, where am I question, is answered by the association's reserve fund strength, best reported in terms of percent funded. And finally, how do I get there, is your recommended reserve contribution rate. It's your association. You've got a lot of important decisions to make. But you can avoid the guessing and wishful thinking and get the direction you need with a current credible reserve study prepared according to National Reserve Study standards. So set yourself up for success by keeping your reserve study current and learning from the reserve study how to adequately fund the reserves, so scheduled repairs and replacements can get accomplished in a timely manner. I want to thank you for joining us today for this overview of working with a reserve study, looking under the hood. If you'd like further information, I recommend you go to our website, www.reservestudy.com, and a couple recommendations are for you to visit our Learning Center, where you'll find articles, our webinar schedule, and recordings of prior webinars. And in addition, you'll find a link to where you can request a proposal for an updated reserve study for your association. And that concludes the prepared portion of my presentation. I'll now turn the floor back to Chris, and with the time remaining, have her act as the moderator for the questions that you've typed in while I've been talking. Chris, back to you.